In the fall of 1942, Viktor Frankl stood inside a barracks at Auschwitz and saw something that changed everything he thought he knew about human beings. All around him were men who had lost everything. Their families were gone. Their homes were gone. Their names had been replaced with numbers. Their dignity had been stripped away piece by piece. These men were starving, their bodies nothing but skin and bones. And yet, in this place built to turn human beings into animals fighting for survival, where a single piece of bread could mean the difference between living and dying. Frankl watched some prisoners do something incredible. They were giving away their last pieces of bread to help other prisoners who were even worse off. This moment hit Frankl like lightning. If people could still love each other here, even in Auschwitz, then something unbreakable in human nature had just revealed itself. The Nazis could take everything. They could take your possessions, your freedom, your health, your hope. They could reduce your life to nothing but the desperate struggle to stay alive one more day. But there was one thing they could not take. They could not take away your freedom to choose how you would respond to what was happening. They could not control what you decided to be on the inside. This was not some theory from a philosophy book. This was real. This was proven in the worst place humans have ever created. Years later, when Frankl wrote about what he lived through, he put this discovery into words that would be repeated millions of times. Everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This sentence became one of the most famous ideas in modern psychology. But its power did not come from beautiful language. Its power came from where it was discovered. This was not some professor's idea. This was truth bought with the highest price anyone can pay. The question at the beginning of Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, sounds simple. What kept some prisoners alive when others gave up and died? The answer was not what you might think. It was not the strongest people who survived. It was not the smartest people. It was not the most ruthless. Being physically fit helped, of course. Luck was huge. But Frankl noticed something that could not be explained by strength or luck alone. The prisoners who survived the longest seemed to be the ones who held on to meaning, who had a reason to keep living. Maybe it was the thought of someone they loved waiting for them. Maybe it was work they had not finished yet. Maybe it was something only they could do in the future. The specific reason was different for everyone, but the pattern was always the same. Having a why to live made even the unbearable something you could bear. This idea did not start with Frankl. He borrowed it from Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote that he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. But Frankl did something remarkable with this idea. He tested it in the worst conditions imaginable and found out it was true. The concentration camps became a terrible laboratory for understanding what really drives human beings at the deepest level. Take away everything: civilization, comfort, safety, pleasure, power, respect. And what is left? Frankl found the answer. The search for meaning is left. Even when everything else is gone, people still look for meaning in their lives. This search for meaning, Frankl came to understand, was not something that only matters after your basic needs are met. It was not a luxury for comfortable people. It was the primary force driving human life, more basic than wanting pleasure or power. This went against the main psychological theories of his time. Sigmund Freud said humans were driven mainly by the pleasure principle, the need to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Alfred Adler said humans were driven mainly by the will to power, the need to be superior and important. Frankl said something different. Humans are driven mainly by the will to meaning, the need to find significance in existence. The camps proved he was right. Prisoners who lost their sense of meaning, who saw no reason to go on, would literally lie down and die. Frankl saw this happen over and over. A prisoner who had been barely surviving would suddenly lose hope, and within days, sometimes within hours, he would die from typhus or dysentery, or he would just stop living. Losing meaning was as deadly as any disease. On the other hand, prisoners who kept hold of some purpose, no matter how small, found strength to continue. They got up in the morning, they did their forced labour. They did not touch the electric fence. They survived another day because maybe that day would bring them closer to their reason for living. This was the strange truth Frankl discovered in Auschwitz. Suffering that has meaning can be endured. Suffering that has no meaning cannot be endured. The same terrible conditions, the cold, the hunger, the cruelty, the humiliation, could feel completely different depending on whether you could find any meaning in what you were going through. Finding meaning did not make the suffering pleasant or easy, but it made it something you could survive. There is a big difference between pain that points to something beyond itself and pain that points to nothing. One kind can fit into the story of your life. The other kind is just senseless torture. Frankl himself survived 4 camps over almost 3 years: Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Kaufering 3, and Turkheim. He survived typhus, starvation, brutal work, and the constant psychological destruction of camp life. What kept him going? He later said there were several sources of meaning that kept him alive. There was the memory of his wife Tilly, whom he loved deeply and dreamed of seeing again. There was the manuscript about logotherapy, his new approach to therapy, which he had sewn into his coat and which was taken when he arrived at Auschwitz. He promised himself to rewrite it if he survived. There was his identity as a psychiatrist, which let him watch and understand what was happening to him and around him, turning his suffering into a kind of study. And there was a growing feeling that if he survived, he would have something important to teach about how humans can find meaning even in meaningless suffering. But Frankl never pretended the camps were anything but evil. He never said that meaning made suffering good or that the Holocaust happened for some higher reason. That would be disgusting. The camps were pure evil. The suffering made no sense. Millions of people died for absolutely no reason. What Frankl was saying was more careful and more radical. Even in the middle of senseless suffering, individual people still have the power to create meaning through how they respond to that suffering. The camps meant nothing, but how you acted in the camps could mean everything. This difference is crucial for understanding what Frankl believed. He was not saying everything happens for a reason or that suffering exists to teach us lessons. He was saying that when suffering cannot be avoided, we can still choose how we relate to it. We can let it destroy us. We can become bitter and broken. We can lose our humanity, or we can keep our dignity. We can choose love instead of hate. We can refuse to let our circumstances control who we are. This choice, this freedom, exists even when every other freedom has been taken away. This is the core of what it means to be human. The image of prisoners giving away their last bread became, for Frankl, the final proof of this freedom. These men could have eaten that bread. Every part of their starving bodies was screaming at them to eat it, but they chose something else. They used their freedom to love and sacrifice instead of just surviving. In doing this, they showed that human nature is not just biology or programming, that something in us can rise above circumstances and even rise above self-interest. Frankl called this the defiant power of the human spirit, and he saw it most clearly in the people who had the least reason to hope. This is where Frankl's story starts, with understanding that in the space between what happens to us and how we respond is where all human freedom lives, where all human dignity lives, and where all human meaning lives. Everything else he taught comes from this insight. The price was terrible. When Frankl walked out of the camps in April 1945, almost everyone he loved was dead. His wife Tilly, murdered in Bergen-Belsen, his mother murdered in Auschwitz, his father dead from starvation in Theresienstadt, his brother Walter dead in Auschwitz. He lost his family, his youth, his health, and years of his life. But he gained something, an understanding of human nature that would help millions find meaning in their own suffering. Viktor Emil Frankl was born on March 26, 1805, in Vienna, Austria, into a Jewish family that valued education and culture. His father Gabriel worked as a civil servant in the Ministry of Social Service, a position that gave the family middle-class security but not wealth. His mother Elsa came from a prosperous family in Prague. Viktor was the middle child, with an older brother Walter and a younger sister Stella. The Vienna of his childhood was a city of extraordinary intellectual ferment, the capital of an empire in its twilight years, but still a beacon of music, art, philosophy, and science. From an early age, Viktor showed an intense curiosity about questions of existence and purpose. As a small boy, lying in bed at night, he would be seized by the awareness that someday he would die, that his parents would die, that everything passes away. This early confrontation with mortality troubled him deeply. He would wake in terror, running to his mother asking why he had to die, why anyone had to die. Rather than being comforted by evasions, he wanted real answers to these existential questions. This childhood anxiety about death and meaning would shape his entire life's work. By his teenage years, Viktor had become fascinated with psychology and philosophy. While still in gymnasium, the equivalent of high school, he began corresponding with Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, whose consulting room was just across Vienna. The young Frankl sent Freud a paper he had written, and Freud was sufficiently impressed to forward it to the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, where it was published in 1924 when Viktor was just 19 years old. This early validation from the master himself might have set Viktor firmly on a Freudian path, but his mind was too independent, too questioning, to accept any single system completely. Around the same time, Frankl also became involved with Alfred Adler's circle. Adler, once Freud's disciple, had broken with the master to develop his own school of individual psychology, which emphasized social factors and the drive for superiority over Freud's emphasis on sexuality, and the unconscious Frankl attended Adler's lectures and became active in his Society for Individual Psychology. For several years, he was enthusiastic about Adler's ideas, finding them more hopeful and less reductive than Freud's emphasis on drives and instincts. But eventually, Frankl found himself disagreeing with Adler as well, particularly on the centrality of the power drive. By 1927, at age 22, Frankl was expelled from Adler's society for heretical views. This double rejection, or double liberation, from the two giants of Viennese psychology forced Frankl to develop his own path. He was learning from both Freud and Adler, but he was also recognizing their limitations. Both systems seemed to reduce human beings to mechanisms, whether driven by pleasure or power. Both were deterministic, viewing humans as products of their past, shaped by childhood experiences and unconscious drives. Frankl was already glimpsing something different, humans as beings oriented toward the future, toward meaning, toward something beyond themselves. This insight would become the foundation of logotherapy, but it would take years and unimaginable suffering to fully articulate it. While studying medicine at the University of Vienna, specializing in neurology and psychiatry, Frankl worked with suicidal patients and became deeply concerned with the epidemic of youth suicide sweeping Vienna in the 1920s and 30s. He organized youth counseling centers that offered free psychological support to students, particularly around exam time when suicide rates spiked. The results were remarkable. In 1930, not a single Viennese student died by suicide during the exam period, a dramatic break from previous years. This early success in suicide prevention reinforced Frankl's intuition that helping people find meaning and purpose was the key to mental health. After completing his medical degree in 1930, Frankl continued his psychiatric training, working at various hospitals and clinics in Vienna. He spent 4 years at the Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital, where he headed a pavilion for suicidal women. His work there deepened his understanding of depression, despair, and the loss of meaning. He saw patients for whom life had become unbearable, not because of any specific trauma or pathology, but because they could no longer find any reason to live. Traditional psychiatric approaches, focused on symptoms and diagnoses, seemed to miss something essential. What these patients needed was not analysis of their past, but help discovering a future worth living for. During these years, Frankl also began developing his ideas about what he would eventually call logotherapy. The term comes from the Greek word logos, which has multiple meanings including meaning, reason, spirit, and word. Logotherapy would be a therapy focused on helping patients find meaning in their lives, based on the premise that the primary human motivation is not pleasure or power, but meaning. Frankl began writing articles and giving lectures on these ideas, slowly building a body of theory that he hoped to publish as a major work. By the late 1930s, he had a manuscript in progress that outlined the basic principles of logotherapy. But the political situation in Austria was deteriorating rapidly. In 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and immediately anti-Jewish laws came into force. Frankl, as a Jew, was forbidden from treating Aryan patients. He could only work in the Rothschild Hospital, Vienna's Jewish hospital, where he became head of the neurological department. The work was both heartbreaking and necessary. Many of his patients were attempting suicide to escape deportation to concentration camps. Frankl did what he could to help, sometimes falsifying diagnoses to keep patients in the hospital and out of the hands of the Nazis. In 1941, despite the growing danger, Viktor married Tilly Grosser, a woman he had known since before the Nazi takeover. This was an act of hope and defiance, choosing love and commitment in a time of darkness. Their happiness was brief. Within months, the deportations began in earnest. Frankl received notification that his elderly parents would be deported. He also received an unexpected reprieve, a visa to America, arranged by someone who had read his work and wanted to save him. He had to make an impossible choice: flee to safety and abandon his parents, or stay and share their fate. His parents could not get visas. If he left, he would never see them again. If he stayed, he would likely die with them. Frankl struggled with this decision for weeks. One day, returning home to the apartment he shared with his parents, he noticed his father had brought home a piece of marble, part of the stone tablets from a synagogue the Nazis had destroyed. On the marble fragment was a carved Hebrew letter, part of one of the 10 Commandments. Frankl asked his father which commandment it came from. His father said it was from the commandment to honor thy father and thy mother. Frankl took this as a sign, a message about what he should do. He let his visa expire. He would stay with his parents. He would not abandon them in their darkest hour. This choice would define the rest of Frankl's life. It was a choice for love over security, for responsibility over self-preservation, for meaning over survival. It was also the choice that would lead him into the camps and all the horrors that awaited him there. But it was a choice he made freely, and that freedom, that conscious decision to accept fate rather than flee it, would become central to his understanding of human dignity. We do not always control what happens to us, but we always control how we respond, what we choose, what we stand for. Frankl stood for family, for duty, for love. The cost would be nearly everything: To understand what Frankl was developing in those pre-war years, we need to step back and survey the landscape of psychology in Vienna. During the first half of the 20th century, Vienna was not just the capital of a dying empire, it was the birthplace of modern psychology. Three towering figures emerged from this small city, each offering a comprehensive theory of human nature and mental illness. Together, they would become known as the three Viennese schools of psychotherapy: Freud's psychoanalysis, Adler's individual psychology, and Frankl's logotherapy. Sigmund Freud founded the first Viennese school with the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899. Freud's revolutionary insight was that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces, particularly repressed sexual desires and childhood traumas. According to Freud, humans are primarily motivated by the pleasure principle, the drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. We are, in Freud's view, sophisticated animals, our rationality merely a thin veneer over deeper instinctual drives. Neurosis arises when these drives are frustrated or repressed, creating internal conflicts that manifest as symptoms. The goal of psychoanalysis is to bring these unconscious conflicts to consciousness through techniques like free association and dream analysis, allowing the patient to integrate their drives more healthily. Freud's system was deterministic. He believed our adult personalities are largely formed by our early childhood experiences, particularly our relationships with our parents, and how we navigate the psychosexual stages of development. We are, in a sense, prisoners of our past, driven by forces we do not understand and cannot control without extensive analysis. This view was revolutionary in its time, liberating many from Victorian repressions and moralistic judgments about mental illness. But it was also, in Frankl's view, reductive and pessimistic. It reduced human beings to their drives and made meaning itself merely a sublimation of frustrated libido. Alfred Adler, initially a member of Freud's inner circle, broke away in 1911 to establish the Second Viennese School. Adler rejected Freud's emphasis on sexuality, arguing instead that humans are primarily motivated by the will to power, the drive to overcome feelings of inferiority and achieve superiority or significance. According to Adler, we all begin life in a state of helplessness and inferiority as children, and our personalities develop around our strategies for compensating for these early feelings. Neurosis arises when our efforts at compensation become maladaptive, when we pursue a fictional goal of superiority that isolates us from others. Adler's psychology was more social and optimistic than Freud's. He emphasized social interest, the capacity for community feeling and contribution, as the hallmark of mental health. He was also more future-oriented, seeing humans as goal-directed beings rather than products of their past. In these respects, Adler influenced Frankl significantly, but Frankl came to believe that Adler too had located the wrong primary motivation. Humans do not primarily seek power or superiority, they seek meaning. The pursuit of power is often a compensatory strategy when meaning is lacking, not the fundamental drive itself. Both Freud and Adler, despite their differences, shared a common assumption that human beings are primarily self-concerned, seeking either pleasure for themselves or power over others. Both viewed humans through what Frankl would later call a homeostatic model, seeing psychological health as a state of equilibrium or tension reduction. The goal is to satisfy drives, whether sexual or social, to achieve a balanced state. Both were also deeply influenced by 19th century scientific materialism, viewing humans as complex machines whose behavior could be explained by mechanical principles of cause and effect. Frankl's logotherapy, which he began developing in the 1930s, represented a radical break from both predecessors. His central claim was that humans are primarily motivated, not by pleasure or power, but by meaning. We are meaning-seeking creatures before we are pleasure-seeking or power-seeking creatures. This is not to say that pleasure and power are unimportant. They clearly matter, but they are better understood as byproducts or means rather than ultimate goals. When we find meaning in our lives, we often experience pleasure and may achieve power or recognition, but these come as side effects, not as the primary aim. Conversely, when we pursue pleasure or power as ends in themselves, we often fail to find them and end up empty despite achieving them. This emphasis on meaning rather than drive reduction gave logotherapy a fundamentally different character from its predecessors. Where Freud looked to the past, to childhood and the unconscious, Frankl looked to the future, to the purposes and meanings that pull us forward. Where both Freud and Adler saw humans as self-concerned, Frankl saw humans as self-transcendent, always reaching beyond ourselves towards something or someone other than ourselves. Meaning is always meaning of something. It has an intentional structure, pointing beyond the self. We find meaning not by looking inward, but by looking outward, toward the tasks life sets before us, toward the people we love, toward the causes we serve. Frankl was influenced not just by Freud and Adler, but by the broader philosophical currents of his time, particularly existentialism and phenomenology. Philosophers like Martin Heidegger, Karl Jaspers, Martin Buber, and Max Scheler were asking fundamental questions about the nature of human existence, questions that resonated deeply with Frankl's clinical observations. What does it mean to exist as a human being? How do we relate to our own mortality? What is authentic existence? How do we encounter other persons? These philosophical questions found their psychological counterpart in Frankl's work. From phenomenology, Frankl borrowed the insight that consciousness is always consciousness of something, that we are intentional beings always directed toward objects beyond ourselves. From existentialism, he took the emphasis on freedom, responsibility, death, and the creation of meaning in a potentially meaningless universe. But Frankl was not merely applying existential philosophy to psychology. He was doing something more original, developing a clinical practice and therapeutic approach based on existential insights, grounded in his empirical observations of patients and later of camp prisoners. By the early 1940s, Frankl had worked out the basic framework of logotherapy. He distinguished between three fundamental freedoms: the freedom of will, which acknowledges that humans have genuine choice despite conditioning; the will to meaning, which posits meaning as the primary human motivation; and the meaning of life, which asserts that life has potential meaning under any circumstances, even the most tragic. He had also begun developing specific therapeutic techniques, particularly what he called paradoxical intention and dereflection, which we will explore later. He had a manuscript nearly complete outlining these ideas. All he needed was time to finish and publish it. Time was the one thing he would not have. In September of 1942, Viktor Frankl, along with his wife Tilly and his parents, received deportation notices they would be sent east to the concentration camps. Frankl took his manuscript, the fruit of years of thought and clinical experience, and sewed it into the lining of his coat. If he survived, he would bring this work with him. If he did not survive, at least he would die knowing he had created something of value, some contribution to human understanding. He could not have imagined that this manuscript would be taken from him within hours of arriving at Auschwitz, or that he would have to reconstruct the entire work from memory, or that this reconstructed work would become one of the most influential books of the 20th century, translated into dozens of languages and read by millions. He only knew that he had something to say about meaning, and the work was not yet finished. The story of Frankl's choice to stay in Vienna rather than flee to America deserves deeper reflection, for it reveals something essential about the philosophy he would later develop. This was not a simple decision between safety and danger, though certainly those were the stakes. It was a decision about what kind of person Frankl would choose to be, what values he would live by, what his life would ultimately mean. In that sense, it was the first great test of his own emerging theory about meaning and freedom. When the American visa arrived in late 1941, Frankl was caught between two imperatives. On one hand, he had an opportunity to save his own life, to preserve his work, to eventually contribute to psychology and help future patients from the safety of America. This was not selfish reasoning. Frankl could legitimately argue that his duty as a physician and thinker required him to survive, to complete his work, to serve the greater good. Many people in similar situations made this choice and were right to do so. The world needed people who could bear witness to what was happening, who could carry forward culture and knowledge and resistance. Fleeing was not cowardice, it was sometimes the most responsible course. On the other hand, Frankl faced the concrete reality of his aging parents who could not get visas and would certainly be deported. If he left, they would face the camps alone. His presence might not save them, but his absence would mean they died without their son beside them. There was also Tilly, his new wife, whom he loved deeply. Could he abandon her? Should he? The marriage was new enough that perhaps she would understand, would urge him to go, to save himself. But could he live with himself if he did? What would it mean for his sense of integrity, his sense of who he was, to choose his own survival over solidarity with those he loved? Frankl later wrote that he sought a sign from heaven, some indication of what he should do. The torn fragment of marble from the destroyed synagogue, inscribed with the commandment to honor one's father and mother, seemed to provide that sign. But we should be careful not to read this as mysticism or abdication of responsibility. Frankl was not claiming that God told him what to do. Rather, he found in that stone fragment an echo of his own deepest values, a confirmation of what he already knew he must do. The decision was his, made in freedom, rooted in his sense of what mattered most. The stone fragment allowed him to articulate to himself what he had already chosen in his heart. This choice exemplifies what Frankl would later call creative values, one of the three pathways to meaning in logotherapy. Creative values are what we give to the world through our actions, our work, our deeds. By choosing to stay with his parents, Frankl was giving something: his presence, his loyalty, his willingness to share their fate. He was also giving up something: his manuscript, his career, very likely his life. But in that giving and giving up, he was creating meaning. His life, even if it ended in the camps, would have stood for something. He would have been faithful to his deepest values. He would have honored the bonds of family and love above self-preservation. This is not to say that Frankl's choice was the only right choice, or that everyone in his situation should have made the same choice. Logotherapy is insistent that meaning is always individual and contextual. There is no universal prescription, no one-size-fits-all answer to existential dilemmas. Someone else in Frankl's position might have been right to flee, might have had a different, unique meaning to fulfill that required survival. Perhaps they had children to protect, or information that needed to reach the Allies, or a scientific discovery that couldn't be lost. The meaning of a situation depends on the particular person in that particular circumstance. What makes Frankl's choice significant is not that it was universally right, but that it was authentically his, freely chosen in accordance with his conscience and values. This authentic choice, made in full awareness of its likely consequences, gave Frankl's subsequent suffering a dimension of meaning it might not otherwise have had. He was not simply a victim of circumstance, though he was certainly that. He was also someone who had actively chosen his path, who had said yes to responsibility, even knowing where it would lead. This element of choice, of active embrace rather than passive submission, would prove crucial to his survival and to his later philosophy. The choice also illustrates what Frankl meant by freedom and responsibility, two concepts that are inseparable in his thought. Freedom without responsibility is license, the ability to do whatever one wants without regard for consequences or values. True human freedom, the kind Frankl identified as the last of the human freedoms, is always freedom for something, freedom in service of some meaning or value. It is the freedom to choose one's response, one's attitude, one's stance toward what life brings. And with that freedom comes responsibility. We cannot blame our circumstances for who we become. We are responsible for the choices we make, the attitudes we adopt, the meanings we pursue. Frankl chose to stay. In September of 1942, he, Tilly, and his parents were deported to Theresienstadt, a concentration camp in Czechoslovakia that the Nazis cynically called a model ghetto. Conditions there were better than in the death camps further east, but still grim. Overcrowding, malnutrition, disease, and the constant threat of further deportation to Auschwitz created an atmosphere of despair. Frankl's father, already elderly and weakened by hardship, died in Theresienstadt of starvation and exhaustion. Viktor was with him at the end, holding his hand, bearing witness. This was the first price of his choice to stay. Watching his father die in captivity, knowing that if he had fled to America, his father would still have died, but Viktor would have lived. The guilt and grief must have been crushing. In October of 1944, Viktor and Tilly were deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. His mother, who remained behind, would be murdered shortly after in the gas chambers. Viktor and Tilly were separated almost immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz. He never saw her again. She was eventually transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she died in the final months of the war, probably of typhus, just weeks or days before liberation. Viktor did not learn of her death until after he was freed. For months in the camps, not knowing her fate, he sustained himself with images of her, conversations with her in his mind, the hope of reunion. When he finally learned she was gone, that hope collapsed, but by then he had discovered other sources of meaning that kept him alive. This choice to stay, with all its terrible consequences, shaped everything that followed. Frankl did not survive the camps by accident or luck alone, though both played their parts. He survived in part because he had already wrestled with the deepest questions of existence before entering the camps, because he had chosen his path consciously, because he understood that suffering could have meaning if one chose the right attitude toward it. The philosophy he would later articulate was not invented in the camps. It was tested there, verified in the most extreme conditions imaginable. The choice to stay was the first test, and Frankl passed it by remaining faithful to his values even unto death. That he survived death and could tell the tale was, in a sense, a bonus. The meaning was in the choice itself, not in its outcome. The train journey from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz took days, though time became distorted in the sealed cattle cars. 150 people crammed into a space designed for a fraction of that number, standing room only, no water, no sanitation, no air, except what leaked through the cracks in the wooden slats. People died standing up. Others went mad. Frankl, trained as a psychiatrist, observed his own reactions and those around him with a kind of clinical detachment, a psychological defense mechanism that would serve him well in the months to come. If he could maintain his identity as an observer, as a scientist studying an extreme situation, he could preserve some core of himself against the dehumanization that awaited. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, SS guards with dogs and whips drove the prisoners out onto the platform. It was night. Blinding lights illuminated the scene. Shouting, chaos, families torn apart, men separated from women and children. Viktor lost sight of Tilly almost immediately. He tried to memorize her face, her expression, the last glimpse he had of her, not knowing it was the last glimpse he would ever have. Then the infamous selection began. SS doctors, including the notorious Joseph Mengele, pointed left or right with casual flicks of their fingers. Left meant immediate death in the gas chambers. Right meant temporary reprieve for forced labour. Most went left. The old, the weak, the children, all went left. Frankl, at 37, still relatively healthy, went right. He did not know at the time what left and right meant. None of the new arrivals did. The Nazis were expert at deception, at managing the prisoners to prevent panic and resistance. Later, when Frankl understood what had happened, he would realize that most of the people he arrived with, hundreds of them, were murdered within hours of the train stopping. The selection process, which seemed at the time merely arbitrary cruelty, was actually a systematic sorting for extermination. Those selected for labour were not being saved. They were being granted a temporary delay before another selection, another sorting, another death. The entire camp system was designed to extract maximum labour from prisoners before disposing of them. After the selection came the initiation into camp life. Everything was taken: clothes, shoes, any remaining personal possessions, all stripped away, hair shaved, bodies disinfected, tattoos inked on forearms. For Frankl, the most devastating loss was his manuscript. Sewn into the lining of his coat, it represented years of work, his contribution to psychology, his life's purpose. When the coat was taken and thrown onto a pile to be burned, Frankl tried to explain to the guard that there was something important in the lining, that he was a doctor, that the papers were scientific work. The guard laughed. Scientific work. In Auschwitz, science meant experiments on living prisoners. Knowledge meant nothing. Work meant slave labour until death. Frankl's identity as a doctor, a scholar, a person who had created something of value, was stripped away with his coat. In its place, he received a prison uniform stripped from a corpse, mismatched and filthy. In one pocket he found a page torn from a Hebrew prayer book, the Shema Yisrael prayer. He took this as another sign, perhaps a continuation of the sign he had received from the marble fragment when deciding to stay. The coincidence, if it was coincidence, suggested that his path was somehow meaningful, that even here in hell there were threads of significance to follow. He would later write that this moment crystallized a new purpose. If he survived, he would reconstruct his manuscript, he would complete his work on logotherapy. The loss of the physical manuscript became the seed of something larger. The work would be written not on paper but in experience, verified not through theory but through survival. But first there was the shock of Auschwitz itself. Frankl, like most prisoners, experienced what he would later identify as the first phase of psychological response to the camps. The shock phase. During this phase, new prisoners oscillate between disbelief and horror. It cannot be real. This cannot be happening, and yet it is real, undeniably, unbearably real. Frankl describes watching one group of new arrivals march toward a chimney from which smoke and flames were rising, the crematorium where bodies were burned day and night. One prisoner asked what the smoke was. An older inmate, with the dark humour common in the camps, replied that it was their friends and families who had gone to the left during selection. The new prisoner refused to believe it. No one could be so cruel. It must be some kind of propaganda, some trick. He had not yet grasped where he was. Another aspect of the shock phase was what Frankl called the delusion of reprieve. This was the desperate hope that somehow one would be exempt from the worst, that there had been some mistake, that one's special skills or connections or innocence would save one. Frankl himself experienced this when he thought his medical training might protect him, that doctors were valuable, that the Nazis would need physicians. In reality, Jewish doctors were worked like any other prisoner and killed just as readily. The delusion of reprieve was a psychological mercy, allowing the mind to adjust gradually to an unbearable reality. But it was also a delusion, and it shattered eventually, leaving prisoners to confront the full truth. They were utterly expendable, their lives worth less than nothing to their captors, their deaths anticipated and planned. Frankl also noticed an unexpected reaction in himself and others during those first days. A curiosity, almost a scientific interest in the situation. How would they respond? What would happen next? What would it feel like to experience complete loss of freedom? This curiosity created a kind of distance, a small buffer between experience and annihilation. By observing what was happening, by trying to understand it, prisoners maintained some thread of their former identities. Frankl the psychiatrist was still there, taking mental notes, analyzing the psychological dynamics. This observing ego, this capacity to step back and witness one's own experience, would prove to be one of the keys to survival. Those who completely identified with their suffering, who became nothing but their pain and degradation, often succumbed quickly. Those who could maintain some observing distance had better chances. After several days at Auschwitz, Frankl was transferred to a smaller satellite camp called Kaufering 3, part of the Dachau complex in Bavaria. Conditions there were in some ways worse than Auschwitz. The camp was a work camp building underground factories for the Nazi war effort. Prisoners lived in crude huts, slept on bare boards, worked 12-hour shifts in all weather, received starvation rations. Death from exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition was commonplace. There were no gas chambers at Kaufering, but death was everywhere. Nevertheless, the mortality rate was such that few prisoners expected to survive more than a few months. Frankl himself contracted typhus, which should have been a death sentence, that he survived. The illness was a combination of his doctor's knowledge of how to manage symptoms, the kindness of other prisoners who helped care for him, and sheer luck. Yet even in Kaufering, even in the depths of that abyss, Frankl observed something remarkable. Not everyone responded to the camps in the same way. Some prisoners collapsed immediately, losing the will to live within days. Others became brutal, adopting the cruelty of their captors, becoming capos and informers who tormented fellow prisoners in exchange for small privileges. But a few, a remarkable few, retained their humanity and even their capacity for kindness. These were the people who gave away their last bread, who comforted the dying, who shared what little they had, who resisted the dehumanization by remaining human. They were not many, but they existed, and their existence proved something crucial, that even in Auschwitz, goodness was possible. Evil had not won completely. The human spirit could resist even this. The loss of his manuscript at Auschwitz might have destroyed a lesser man. For Frankl, it became transformative. He had spent years developing his ideas about logotherapy, writing and rewriting, refining his arguments, preparing what he hoped would be his contribution to psychiatric thought. That manuscript represented not just intellectual work, but identity itself. Frankl was a doctor, a thinker, a contributor to human knowledge. When the manuscript was taken and thrown away like garbage, that identity seemed to vanish. He was no longer a doctor or a scholar. He was prisoner. Number 119 and 4, a number tattooed on his arm, a slave labourer whose life was measured in the calories he could extract from watery soup and the warmth he could find in a freezing barracks. But Frankl made a choice in that moment of loss. Rather than allowing despair to overwhelm him, rather than concluding that his life's work was meaningless and therefore his life was meaningless, he reconceived the task. The manuscript was gone, but the ideas remained in his memory. If he survived, he could reconstruct it, perhaps even improve it, based on his experiences. The camps themselves became, in a grim sense, a laboratory for testing his theories. If the human search for meaning was truly the primary motivation, then surely it would manifest here, in conditions designed to reduce people to pure survival. If the will to meaning was stronger than the will to pleasure or power, then observation of the camps would prove it. Frankl decided to pay attention, to observe, to remember, to survive if possible, so he could bear witness. This decision gave him a specific purpose during the worst months. He would mentally reconstruct his manuscript, going over the chapters in his mind, refining arguments, adding examples from his observations. When he was digging or carrying stones or standing for hours in frozen roll calls, he would think through sections of the book. The work became a kind of meditation, a way to escape mentally while remaining physically present. Other prisoners daydreamed about food or comfort or revenge. Frankl daydreamed about completing his interrupted work. This seemingly small difference in how he occupied his mind may have contributed to his survival. The original manuscript was titled The Doctor and the Soul, meant to be a comprehensive textbook of logotherapy. After liberation, Frankl would indeed write a book with that title, published in 1946 in German. But the book that would make him famous was different. That book emerged from the convergence of two impulses: the drive to reconstruct his theoretical work and the need to tell what he had witnessed. He realized that he could not simply present logotherapy as abstract theory. He needed to ground it in experience, to show where these ideas came from, to prove them through the testimony of Auschwitz. Theory and memoir would intertwine. In the camps, Frankl began making mental notes not just of psychological theory, but of specific incidents that illustrated his points. He remembered the man who gave away his last cigarette, a currency more valuable than gold in the camps. He remembered the woman who died pointing to a tree outside the barracks window, saying she talked to the tree and it told her she would not die alone. He remembered the night a particularly suicidal group of prisoners was discouraged from touching the electrified fence by improvised counselling. He remembered watching a sunset with other prisoners, finding beauty even in Auschwitz. These moments became evidence, data points in an argument that meaning was possible even under the most meaning-destroying conditions imaginable. There's a particular poignancy to Frankl reconstructing his life's work from memory, while simultaneously experiencing the most extreme test of that work's validity. It's one thing to theorize about meaning in the safety of a Vienna consulting room, working with neurotic patients whose suffering, while real, takes place against a backdrop of civilization and comfort. It's quite another to maintain that meaning is possible while starving, while watching people die daily, while wondering if you'll be selected for the gas chamber tomorrow. Frankl was testing his own theories on himself, and the stakes were life and death. If he was wrong, if meaning was not possible in Auschwitz, then his work was false and his own survival would be mere chance, signifying nothing. But he found, again and again, that the theory held. When he imagined conversations with Tilly, rehearsing in his mind what he would tell her if they reunited, he experienced meaning through love, what he would later categorize as experiential values. When he helped other prisoners with medical advice or psychological support, making small contributions despite having almost nothing to give, he experienced meaning through service, what he called creative values, and when nothing could be done, when suffering was unavoidable and circumstances utterly beyond control, he could still choose his attitude, still maintain his dignity, still refuse to let the camps destroy his humanity. This was attitudinal values, the supreme pathway to meaning, available even in Auschwitz. The manuscript in the coat became a metaphor for something deeper. We all carry with us our sense of identity, our life's work, our contribution to the world, and life can tear it away from us without warning. Illness, accident, injustice, catastrophe, any of these can strip away what we thought defined us. We lose the career we built, the person we loved, the health we took for granted, the future we planned. The question becomes, what remains when everything is taken? Frankl's answer, forged in the camps. The freedom to choose one's attitude remains. The capacity to find meaning remains. These cannot be taken unless we surrender them. In a way, losing the physical manuscript freed Frankl to write a better book. The original was probably too academic, too technical, too distant from lived experience. By losing it and reconstructing it through the lens of the camps, Frankl created something more powerful. A work that was simultaneously memoir and philosophy, testimony and theory, personal and universal man's search for meaning. The book he would eventually write is structured in two parts: a narrative account of his experience in the camps, followed by an introduction to logotherapy. But these two parts are not separate. The theory emerges from the experience. The experience illustrates the theory. You cannot understand logotherapy without understanding Auschwitz, and you cannot understand what Frankl survived without understanding the ideas that sustained him. There's also something profoundly moving about Frankl's determination to complete his work. He could have decided, reasonably enough, that his scholarly ambitions were irrelevant given the scale of the catastrophe. He could have focused solely on physical survival, on getting enough food and warmth, and avoiding selections. Many prisoners did exactly that, and who can blame them? But Frankl maintained his identity as a thinker, a contributor, a person with something to say. Even if he didn't survive, he could mentally complete the work, could go to his death knowing he had thought it through, had articulated what he discovered. This maintenance of purpose, this refusal to be reduced to mere biological survival, was itself an act of resistance against the dehumanization the camps were designed to accomplish. When Frankl did survive and was liberated in April of 1945, one of his first acts was to begin writing. His body was emaciated, his health broken, his world destroyed. Everyone he loved was dead. But he had a manuscript to reconstruct, and it gave him something to live for in those first terrible months after liberation. In 9 days, in a kind of possessed frenzy, he dictated the first version of what would become Man's Search for Meaning. 9 days to pour out years of experience and thought, to capture what he had witnessed before memory faded or trauma distorted it. The urgency was palpable. He had survived for a reason: to tell this story, to share these insights, to prevent the suffering from being meaningless. The manuscript he reconstructed was not the one he lost, but it was something better. Truth tested in the furnace of extremity. Frankl's psychiatric training gave him a unique perspective on camp life. While others experienced the horror viscerally, but without framework, Frankl observed and categorized, turning his trauma into data. This was not emotional coldness, but professional discipline, a way to maintain sanity by trying to understand what was happening. He identified 3 distinct psychological phases that most prisoners experienced: the period following admission, the period when they were well entrenched in camp routine, and the period following release and liberation. Each phase had its characteristic psychological symptoms and adaptations, and understanding these phases helped Frankl make sense of his own journey and that of his fellow prisoners. The first phase, which we've already touched on, was the shock phase. This period, usually lasting from admission until a few days afterward, was characterized by acute anxiety, disbelief, and the delusion of reprieve. Frankl noticed that different personalities responded differently. Some became hysterical, breaking down completely, sobbing or screaming or catatonic with terror. These prisoners often didn't survive long. The camps had no patience for weakness, and those who couldn't quickly adapt were selected for death or simply collapsed. Others responded with a grim determination, immediately trying to figure out the rules, to find angles, to survive by any means. Still others, like Frankl, retreated into observation and analysis, creating psychological distance as a defense mechanism. One particularly interesting phenomenon in the shock phase was what Frankl called the delusion of reprieve that condemned prisoners experience leading up to execution. He drew this comparison between condemned criminals and camp prisoners deliberately. In both cases, there is a desperate hope that something will intervene, that the horror is not really happening or will somehow be prevented, even when prisoners intellectually understood they would probably die. Emotionally, they clung to the belief that they would be the exception. This delusion was adaptive in small doses, providing enough hope to keep going. But it was also dangerous when it prevented prisoners from recognizing real threats or taking what small actions might improve their chances. As the shock wore off, usually within days or weeks, prisoners entered the second phase. Apathy. This was by far the longest phase for those who survived beyond the first selection. Apathy was not exactly depression, though it shared features with it. Rather, it was a protective numbing, an emotional shutdown necessary for survival. Frankl described it as a mechanism of self-defense that develops in the mind of prisoners. To remain sensitive, to feel fully the pain and horror and degradation, would be unbearable. The psyche protects itself by dulling feeling, by creating a kind of emotional death that allows physical survival. In the apathy phase, prisoners became indifferent to things that would normally provoke strong reactions. Beatings became routine, merely events to avoid if possible, and endure if not. Death became common, hardly worth noticing. A man might die in the bunk next to you, and your primary response would be annoyance that you had to help carry the corpse and wouldn't inherit his shoes because they were too small. Food became the only thing that mattered, the sole source of pleasure or interest. Every thought, every conversation, every moment revolved around getting enough to eat. This was not greed but biological necessity, the body's desperate attempt to survive on 800 calories a day of watery soup and a few ounces of bread. The apathy was so pervasive that prisoners stopped reacting normally even to what should have been positive events. Frankl describes his own lack of emotion when he finally received a piece of mail from his wife Tilly, confirmation she was still alive at the time. He felt nothing, or almost nothing. The capacity for joy had atrophied. This worried him from a professional standpoint. He wondered if the emotional damage would be permanent, if survivors would ever be able to feel normally again. But he also recognized that the apathy was saving his life, allowing him to endure what could not be endured if fully felt. Within this overall apathy, prisoners developed coping mechanisms that provided small islands of relief. Fantasy was one of the most common. Prisoners would spend hours imagining meals they would eat after liberation, describing in excruciating detail the foods they would prepare, the restaurants they would visit, the delicacies they would savor. Others fantasized about revenge against the guards and SS officers who tormented them. Still others, like Frankl, engaged in more constructive fantasies, imagining reunions with loved ones, planning future work, mentally composing books or lectures or business plans. These fantasies served multiple purposes. They provided escape from present misery. They maintained connection to one's pre-camp identity, and they provided something to look forward to, a future that made survival worthwhile. Another coping mechanism was humor, particularly dark humor. Prisoners would joke about their situation, making light of horrors that would drive them mad if confronted directly. Frankl himself tried to train a friend in this technique, suggesting they each invent an amusing story daily about something that could happen after liberation, using their camp experiences as material for humor. The friend eventually died, but Frankl continued the practice, finding that the ability to laugh at the absurdity of the situation preserved some core of humanity. Humor requires perspective, the ability to step outside immediate experience and see it from a distance. Maintaining that perspective was crucial for mental survival. Religion was another important coping mechanism, though its effectiveness varied. Some prisoners found great comfort in faith, believing that God had a purpose for their suffering, or that their suffering was a test they must endure. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile the existence of a good God with the reality of Auschwitz. Frankl, while acknowledging the power of religious faith for some, did not make faith central to his own survival or his later philosophy. Logotherapy could be practiced by religious and non-religious people alike. What mattered was finding meaning, whether that meaning was rooted in faith or in secular values and purposes. Perhaps the most important psychological adaptation was what Frankl called the retreat from life into the inner self. Physical reality in the camps was utterly degrading and depressing. The barracks were filthy, overcrowded, infested with lice and rats. The work was exhausting and pointless, mere slavery to feed the Nazi war machine. The guards were brutal and capricious. There was nothing in the external world to provide comfort or dignity, so prisoners learned to live primarily in their inner world, in memory and imagination, in relationships with others that transcended the physical misery, in small moments of beauty or connection that redeemed the horror. Frankl's most famous example of this inner life is his recurring visualization of his wife. During the long marches to work detail, cold and exhausted, he would imagine Tilly walking beside him. He would have conversations with her in his mind, telling her about his experiences, hearing her responses, feeling her presence. He did not know at the time that she had already died, that these conversations were with a ghost. But that did not matter. The love he felt, the connection he maintained, the meaning he derived from this interior relationship, these were real regardless of her physical survival. This is one of the most profound insights of logotherapy. Love transcends the physical presence of the beloved. The meaning of love does not depend on the loved one being alive or available. It depends on our capacity to love, which cannot be taken from us. Another dimension of this inner retreat was the appreciation of beauty, even in Auschwitz. Frankl describes watching sunsets with other prisoners, finding in the display of colours a brief transcendence of their circumstances. The sky did not care about the camps. Beauty existed independently of human cruelty. That a sunset could be beautiful, even when viewed from a slave labour camp, was strange and consoling. It meant that not everything was corrupted, that there were dimensions of reality that remained pure. Frankl also mentions moments when prisoners would quietly recite poetry or sing songs, creating culture in the midst of barbarism. These acts were dangerous. Any distraction from work could be punished, but they were necessary. They asserted that prisoners were human beings with souls, not merely bodies to be worked to death. The third psychological phase Frankl identified was the period following liberation. One might expect that liberation would bring immediate joy and relief, and indeed there was initially that reaction. But Frankl observed a more complex and darker process as well. Many prisoners experienced what we might now call post-traumatic stress, though that term did not exist in Frankl's time. They were haunted by nightmares, unable to believe their freedom was real, waiting for the dream to end and the nightmare to resume. Some experienced moral revulsion at what they had done or seen or failed to do to survive. Others felt overwhelming grief as the full reality of their losses hit them. During the apathy phase, prisoners had numbed themselves to loss. After liberation, the numbness wore off and the pain flooded in. Frankl also observed what he called bitterness and disillusionment in many survivors. They had imagined that liberation would bring understanding and sympathy, that the world would recognize what they had endured and welcome them with open arms. Instead, many found indifference or even hostility. People did not want to hear about the camps, found the stories too disturbing, moved on quickly to their own concerns. Some survivors returned to find their homes occupied by strangers, their property stolen, their communities destroyed. They had survived hell only to find that the world they had hoped to return to no longer existed. This disillusionment sometimes led to moral danger, as survivors concluded that nothing mattered, that cruelty was the only reality, that they should take what they could and trust no one. Frankl himself experienced all three phases, though his psychological training helped him navigate them with some degree of awareness. The shock of arrival, the apathy of daily camp life, the bitterness of liberation, he felt each one. What saved him, he believed, was his determination to find meaning in the experience, to learn from it, to transform it into something useful. He could not prevent the suffering, could not avoid the trauma, could not bring back the dead. But he could choose to let the experience deepen his understanding of human nature, could use his survival to help others, could write the book that would carry the lessons of the camps to millions. This sense of purpose, formed in the camps and maintained after liberation, gave his suffering meaning and his survival direction. The psychology of the camps, as Frankl described it, was fundamentally about adaptation to the unadaptable, finding ways to remain human under conditions designed to destroy humanity. Not everyone succeeded. Many died, and many who survived were broken in permanent ways. But some, a remarkable few, emerged with their humanity intact or even deepened. These were the people who found ways to maintain meaning, who helped others, who preserved their values, who refused to let circumstances dictate their character. These were the witnesses to what Frankl called the defiant power of the human spirit, and their testimony became the empirical foundation for logotherapy. One of the most haunting questions Frankl wrestled with was this: why did some prisoners survive while others perished? This was not an academic question. It was personal, immediate, surrounded by death. Every day brought new selections, new deaths from disease or exhaustion or violence. Survival seemed random, a matter of luck, being in the right place at the right time, avoiding the wrong guard's attention, not catching typhus or dysentery. And certainly, luck played an enormous role. Many good people died, many terrible people survived. There was no cosmic justice operating in the camps, no guarantee that the virtuous would live and the wicked would die. Yet within the randomness, Frankl observed patterns. Physical strength mattered obviously. Those who arrived at the camps already weakened by poverty or illness died quickly. The elderly, the children, the sick, they had almost no chance. But among those who were reasonably healthy upon arrival, physical strength alone did not predict survival. Some of the strongest men died within weeks, while some apparently weaker individuals lasted months or years. Something else was operating, something psychological or spiritual that gave certain people greater resilience. Frankl's conclusion, based on careful observation, those who survived longest were not the strongest or the cleverest, but those who had a strong sense of purpose, a reason to live, a future task that only they could fulfill. This was Nietzsche's principle in action. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Those who maintained connection to a why, a loved one to return to, a work to complete, a faith to uphold, a testimony to bear, found resources to continue that those without such purposes could not access. The why did not guarantee survival. Nothing could do that. But it significantly improved the odds. Frankl tells the story of two men who were contemplating suicide in the camps. Both had reached the point where continued existence seemed unbearable, where death promised relief from endless suffering. Frankl, as a psychiatrist, was asked to counsel them. He didn't argue that life was always worth living, didn't offer false hope that liberation was coming soon, didn't minimize their suffering. Instead, he asked each man a question. What are you living for? What is waiting for you that only you can do or be? For one man, it was his child, who had escaped to a foreign country and was waiting for him. For the other, it was his work, a series of books on geography that only he could complete. In both cases, Frankl helped them see that their lives had meaning beyond their present suffering, that someone or something needed them, that suicide would leave a task unfulfilled or a person abandoned. Both men decided to live. Whether they ultimately survived the camps, Frankl doesn't tell us. But in that moment, reconnection with purpose gave them reason to continue. The child and the books were future meanings, pulling these men forward toward a horizon beyond the barbed wire. This illustrates a key principle of logotherapy. Meaning is always ahead of us, in the future, in tasks we have not yet completed. We are pulled by meanings rather than pushed by drives. This future orientation distinguishes logotherapy from psychoanalysis, which focuses on the past and unconscious drives. Frankl also observed who died and how. There were predictable patterns. A prisoner who received bad news, that his wife had been killed, that his business was destroyed, that his home was occupied, would often die within days. The loss of hope was visible and rapid. First came a spiritual collapse, a giving up, a conclusion that continuing was pointless. Then came physical collapse. The prisoner would refuse to get up for roll call, would stop eating even the minimal rations, would ignore the guards' threats and beatings. Within days, sometimes within hours, such prisoners died. They had decided to die, and their bodies complied. The opposite was also observable. A prisoner who maintained hope, who had reasons to believe liberation might come, or who simply committed to surviving one more day, could endure extraordinary hardships. There were prisoners who survived beatings that killed others, who recovered from diseases that were usually fatal, who kept working despite injuries that should have incapacitated them. Something in them refused to give up, and that refusal translated into physical resilience. Mind and body were not separate in the camps. The will to live, rooted in meaning, had tangible physiological effects. This is not to say that maintaining hope was always possible, or that those who died had somehow failed. The camps were designed to break people, and they succeeded more often than not. Frankl is careful never to blame the victims. He's not saying that people died because they lacked meaning or that survivors were morally superior. Survival was largely chance. What he is saying is that among those factors that contributed to survival, luck, health, position, connections, having a strong sense of meaning was also a factor, perhaps the most important psychological factor. The prisoner hierarchy also affected survival odds, though in morally troubling ways. At the bottom were the ordinary prisoners, who had no privileges and bore the full weight of camp brutality. Above them were the prominents, prisoners who had positions of relative privilege, clerks, doctors, cooks, barracks leaders. These positions came with better food, lighter work, protection from some of the worst abuses. Getting such a position dramatically improved survival chances. But obtaining these positions often required moral compromises, collaboration with the SS, betrayal of fellow prisoners, participation in the machinery of oppression. The most morally complex figures were the capos, prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise other prisoners. Some capos were as brutal as the SS guards themselves, beating and tormenting their fellow prisoners with sadistic enthusiasm. These capos were hated even more than the SS because they were traitors, prisoners who had become perpetrators. But Frankl notes that not all capos were cruel. A few used their positions to protect other prisoners, to distribute food more fairly, to warn of upcoming selections. These good capos risked their own lives, because if the SS suspected them of being too soft, they would lose their positions and likely be killed. This variation in capo behavior illustrated something crucial for Frankl. Evil and goodness are not determined by circumstances or positions, but by choices. A capo could choose to be decent or brutal. A prisoner with no power could choose to share or hoard, to help or ignore, to resist or collaborate in small ways with dehumanization. The camps revealed character. They did not create it. Some people became worse versions of themselves under pressure. Others became better, rising to a level of moral heroism that would have been unnecessary in normal life. Most people, Frankl observed, were somewhere in between, trying to survive without becoming monsters, occasionally rising to small acts of kindness, occasionally sinking to small acts of cruelty. Frankl rejected the idea that the camps proved human nature is fundamentally selfish or evil. Yes, there was terrible cruelty, both from the SS and from prisoners who brutalized their fellows. But there was also extraordinary goodness. The prisoners who gave away their last food, who helped the sick, who risked punishment to comfort the dying, who maintained their integrity despite every incentive to abandon it. These acts of goodness were more significant, Frankl argued, precisely because they occurred in conditions that made goodness seem impossible. In a comfortable life, being decent is relatively easy. In Auschwitz, every act of kindness was a triumph of the human spirit over circumstance. The question of who survived and why haunted Frankl for the rest of his life. He never claimed to have a complete answer. Too much was chance. Too much was luck. Too many good people died, and too many terrible people lived. But within the chaos and randomness, he found a pattern. Meaning sustains life. Those who could find or maintain a sense that their life had meaning, that their survival served some purpose beyond mere biological continuation, had better chances. This observation, purchased with the lives of millions, became the cornerstone of logotherapy. If meaning can sustain life even in Auschwitz, it can sustain life anywhere. If the will to meaning is strong enough to keep people alive in death camps, then it must be the most fundamental human motivation. These were not many. Frankl is clear about that. The vast majority of prisoners kept whatever food they obtained and would have taken food from others if they could. This is not a moral judgment, but a simple acknowledgement of human limitation. Starvation changes people, reduces the world to the immediate need for calories. Most prisoners spent every waking moment thinking about food, dreaming about food, scheming for any way to get more food. In such a state, generosity becomes nearly impossible. The body's survival instinct overrides everything else. But some prisoners, a remarkable few, transcended this instinct. They looked at a fellow prisoner who was weaker, more starving, closer to death, and they chose to give up their own ration. Sometimes this was bread. Sometimes it was their thin, watery soup. Sometimes it was a cigarette that could be traded for bread. Whatever the gift, it represented a choice to prioritize another's survival over one's own. This was not sentimentality or ignorance of consequences. These prisoners knew exactly what they were doing. They were choosing to die a little faster so someone else might live a little longer. What motivated such acts? Frankl's answer is complex, but centers on meaning. These prisoners had found something more important to them than mere survival: their identity as moral beings, their commitment to love or compassion, their refusal to let the camps destroy their humanity. For them, to hoard food while watching another starve would be to become the kind of person they refused to be. They had drawn a line. They would rather die as decent human beings than survive by becoming selfish brutes. This was not irrational. It was a different kind of rationality, one that recognized life is about more than duration, that who we are matters more than how long we last. These acts of generosity proved something essential to Frankl's philosophy. Human beings are not ultimately determined by their circumstances, their biology, or their conditioning. There is a space of freedom between what happens to us and how we respond. In that space lives everything that makes us human: the capacity to choose, to transcend self-interest, to act according to values rather than impulses, to remain true to our sense of who we are even when no one is watching and nothing external compels us. The prisoners who gave away their bread were exercising this freedom in its purest form. Frankl contrasts this with deterministic theories of human behavior. Freud's psychoanalysis suggested we are driven by unconscious forces, particularly sexual and aggressive drives, over which we have little real control. Our behavior is determined by childhood experiences and unconscious conflicts. Behaviorism, which was influential in Frankl's time, went even further, arguing that we are simply products of conditioning, responding mechanistically to stimuli according to patterns of reinforcement. Even Adler's individual psychology, while less reductive than Freud or behaviorism, emphasized how childhood feelings of inferiority determine our adult strivings for superiority. All these theories, Frankl argued, failed to account for what he witnessed in the camps: genuine freedom. The prisoner who gave away his bread was not responding to conditioning. No one had reinforced such behavior. Quite the opposite, it was punished by death. He was not driven by unconscious forces. Such generosity required conscious choice against every instinct. He was not compensating for inferiority feelings. He was acting from strength, from a secure sense of identity that transcended circumstances. He was exercising what Frankl called the defiant power of the human spirit, the capacity to rise above determinism and become the author of one's own attitudes and choices. This freedom was not unlimited. The prisoners couldn't choose to leave the camps, couldn't choose to be comfortable or safe, couldn't choose to save everyone they loved. Most of their lives were indeed determined by forces beyond their control: the Nazi regime, the war, the selections, the diseases, the brutality of the guards. But within the narrow space that remained, they could choose their attitude, their response, their stance toward what was happening. They could choose to give away bread or hoard it, to help or ignore, to maintain dignity or surrender it. These choices were small, often invisible to others, but they were real. And for the individuals making them, they were everything. The image of the last piece of bread became for Frankl the ultimate empirical proof of human freedom. If someone can freely choose to give away their survival in Auschwitz, then freedom is not an illusion or a philosophical abstraction. It is the most concrete reality, verifiable in the most extreme conditions. This does not mean freedom is easy or that everyone exercises it. Most people don't, even in normal circumstances. We are lazy, we follow habits, we let circumstances dictate our responses. We identify completely with our reactions, but the capacity for freedom is always there, waiting to be activated. The camps revealed this capacity in sharp relief because they eliminated every other freedom, leaving only this one: the freedom to choose one's attitude. Frankl was also struck by what these acts revealed about human nature at its best. In ordinary life, we rarely see people tested to such extremes. Most people are decent enough, but we don't know how deep that decency goes. Would they remain decent under pressure? Would they sacrifice for others if it cost them dearly? Would they maintain their values when no one was enforcing them? The camps answered these questions definitively. Some people, when pushed to the limit, revealed themselves to be capable of extraordinary goodness. Not many, but enough to prove that such goodness is possible, that it exists as a real potential in human nature. This observation had profound implications for psychology and philosophy. If human beings are capable of selfless love in Auschwitz, then theories that explain all behavior as ultimately selfish are false. If prisoners can maintain moral integrity in conditions designed to destroy it, then determinism is incomplete. If the will to meaning can overcome the will to pleasure and the will to power, then Freud and Adler had identified important human motivations, but missed the most fundamental one. The last piece of bread was not just an act of kindness, it was evidence for a different understanding of what human beings are and can be. Frankl also saw in these acts the highest form of what he would call attitudinal values, one of the three pathways to meaning in logotherapy. When circumstances eliminate the possibility of creative action or experiential joy, when nothing external can be changed or enjoyed, meaning can still be found in the attitude one adopts toward unavoidable suffering. The prisoner who gave away his bread could not change his situation, could not escape or fight back or make things better. But he could choose to be generous, to be loving, to be human. That choice transformed meaningless suffering into meaningful sacrifice. It didn't make the suffering good or worthwhile in itself, but it redeemed it, gave it a dimension of significance it would not otherwise have had. Years later, when Frankl taught about logotherapy, he would often return to this image. He would describe the prisoner with his last piece of bread, facing a choice: eat it or give it away. And he would ask his audiences, what does this prove about human nature? The answer was always the same. It proves that freedom is real, that meaning is possible under any circumstances, that we are not merely biological organisms, but spiritual beings capable of transcending self-interest. The last piece of bread is an icon, a sacred image in the secular religion of meaning. It represents the irreducible dignity of human existence, the indestructible core that survives when everything else is stripped away. Memory was one of the most important refuges. Prisoners would spend hours remembering better times, childhood moments, family gatherings, travels, accomplishments, love affairs. These memories served multiple purposes. They reminded prisoners of who they had been before the camps, maintaining identity against the camp's erasure of individuality. They provided proof that happiness had once existed and might exist again, countering the totalizing horror of the present. And they offered escape, a mental journey away from the barracks to times and places where one had been safe and valued. Frankl's most powerful use of memory was his constant mental communion with his wife Tilly. During the long marches to work sites, freezing in inadequate clothing, exhausted and starving, Frankl would imagine Tilly walking beside him. He would have conversations with her, tell her about his day, hear her voice responding with love and encouragement. He would recall specific memories of their time together, her smile, her laugh, moments of intimacy and joy. These memories and imaginings sustained him through the worst periods. The profound irony, which Frankl only learned after liberation, was that Tilly had already died while he was communing with her memory. She perished in Bergen-Belsen, probably within weeks or months of their separation. The conversations Frankl was having were with a ghost, a mental construct based on memory and imagination. But here is the remarkable insight. It didn't matter the love Frankl felt was real. The meaning he derived from that love was real. The sustaining power of his connection to Tilly was undiminished by her physical death, because love transcends physical presence. This would become one of logotherapy's most beautiful and consoling teachings, that the meaning of love does not depend on the beloved being alive or available. Love is an achievement of the lover, a stance toward another person, and as such it can exist even after death. Imagination complemented memory as an escape route. Prisoners imagined futures beyond the camps, the meals they would eat, the clothes they would wear, the reunions with loved ones, the revenge they would take on their tormentors, the lives they would rebuild. Some of these imaginings were pure fantasy, wish fulfillment with no basis in likely reality. But they served a purpose. They asserted that there was a future, that the camps were not eternal, that life would continue. Even if a prisoner died before liberation, the act of imagining a future maintained a temporal structure, a sense that life was not frozen in eternal suffering, but moving towards something. Frankl used imagination in a more disciplined way. He would mentally reconstruct his lost manuscript, thinking through chapters, refining arguments, composing sentences. This was not mere daydreaming, but serious intellectual work conducted entirely in his head. He was maintaining his identity as a thinker and writer even when he had no pen or paper, even when all external signs of that identity had been erased. This mental work gave structure to his inner life and provided a sense of purpose. If he survived, he would write this book. If he didn't survive, at least he would have thought it through to completion. Art and beauty also provided crucial sustenance for the inner life. The camps were designed to be ugly, degrading, devoid of beauty. The barracks were crude and filthy. The landscape was barren or industrial. The prisoners were skeletal and in rags. Everything was meant to crush the spirit by eliminating anything elevating or beautiful. But beauty could not be entirely banished. There were sunsets, visible through the barracks windows or during work details. There was the occasional tree or flower. There was music, sometimes forced labour songs, but sometimes prisoners singing quietly to themselves. There was poetry, recited from memory. There were moments when prisoners would stop and simply look at something beautiful, risking punishment for the sake of a few seconds of aesthetic experience. Frankl describes a particularly powerful sunset he witnessed with fellow prisoners. After a brutal day of work, exhausted and freezing, the prisoners paused to watch the sky turn brilliant colours. Someone whispered, "How beautiful," and the others nodded. For those few minutes, they were not merely camp inmates, but human beings capable of appreciating beauty. The sunset had no practical value. It didn't feed them or warm them or bring liberation closer, but it fed something else. The part of them that was more than mere survival, the aesthetic and spiritual dimension that the camps could not kill unless they killed the prisoners themselves. Frankl mentions that in that moment, someone quoted a line of poetry and someone else responded with another line. Culture was alive even in Auschwitz, fragile but undestroyed. Humour was another crucial element of the inner life, though it might seem strange to talk about humour in the context of Auschwitz. But gallows humour was common among prisoners. They made jokes about the guards, about their own situation, about death itself. This was not frivolous or disrespectful. It was a survival mechanism. Humour requires perspective, the ability to step outside one's immediate suffering and see it from a distance. That capacity for distance, for not identifying completely with one's pain, was protective. Those who could laugh, even bitterly, maintained a core of self that was not entirely consumed by suffering. Frankl tried to train himself and a friend in forcing oneself to develop a sense of humour about camp life. He suggested they each invent one amusing story daily about something that might happen after liberation, using their camp experiences as material. The friend eventually died, but Frankl continued the practice. He would imagine himself after the war, giving lectures about the psychology of the concentration camps. He would picture himself standing at a podium in a warm, comfortable lecture hall, describing to well-fed, safe people what it had been like. The contrast was simultaneously painful and amusing. The practice helped him maintain perspective. This would end, and when it did, his experiences would have value as testimony and teaching material. Relationships also constituted a crucial dimension of the inner life. Even in the camps, where competition for resources was brutal and trust was dangerous, some prisoners formed genuine friendships. These relationships were lifelines, providing emotional support, practical help, and affirmation of one's humanity. A friend might share food when you were weakest, might cover for you when you couldn't work, might simply sit beside you and acknowledge your suffering. These small acts of solidarity reminded prisoners they were not completely alone, that human connection could survive even in Auschwitz. Frankl also notes the importance of helping others as a way to maintain inner dignity. When he had knowledge that could help someone, medical advice, psychological counsel, a word of encouragement, giving that help maintained his identity as a doctor and healer. He was not just a prisoner, but a person with something to offer, with a role to play beyond mere survival. This was true for others as well. A man who could fix a tool, a woman who knew a song, anyone who had any skill or knowledge that could benefit others. These people maintained a sense of purpose that pure survival could not provide. Prayer and meditation were important for some prisoners, though not for all. Those with strong religious faith often found comfort in prayer, in the belief that God was with them even in the camps, that their suffering had meaning in a larger divine plan. Frankl was respectful of religious faith, but did not make it central to his own survival or philosophy. He was more interested in the universal human capacity for meaning-making, which could be expressed through religion but was not dependent on it. What mattered was that prisoners found some way to maintain an inner life that transcended their immediate circumstances, whether through faith, memory, imagination, beauty, humour, relationships, or purpose. The richness of the inner life was directly proportional to psychological survival. Prisoners who had nothing but external reality, the cold, the hunger, the cruelty, the fear, often collapsed quickly. There was nothing to sustain them, nothing to counterbalance the horror. But prisoners who could retreat into memory or imagination, who could find beauty in a sunset or comfort in prayer, who maintained relationships or a sense of purpose. These prisoners had resources the camps could not destroy. Their inner lives became fortresses, refuges where they could still be themselves, despite everything the Nazis did to break them. This insight would become central to logotherapy's approach to suffering. When external circumstances are terrible and unchangeable, meaning can still be found in one's inner attitude, in how one relates to the suffering, in what one preserves of oneself despite the suffering. The camps proved this empirically. Frankl saw prisoners who had lost everything external, but maintained their humanity through the cultivation of a rich inner life. He saw others who had lost that inner life, and shortly after, lost their lives. The correlation was clear. The inner life is not a luxury or an escape from reality. It is essential to survival and to human dignity. To remain human under conditions designed to destroy humanity requires refuge in an inner realm that cannot be touched by external force. On April 29, 1945, American troops liberated the camp at Turkheim, the last of the 4 camps where Frankl had been imprisoned. The prisoners, those who had survived to see that day, experienced a range of emotions that Frankl would later describe as the 3rd phase of camp psychology, the period after liberation. One might expect this to be a moment of pure joy, a Hollywood ending where suffering gives way instantly to relief and celebration. The reality was far more complicated and in some ways almost as traumatic as the camps themselves. The first emotion many prisoners felt was disbelief. For years they had imagined liberation, but now that it was happening, it didn't seem real. The American soldiers, well-fed and healthy in clean uniforms, seemed like apparitions from another world. The prisoners, emaciated and filthy, could barely process what was happening. Some wandered around the camp in a daze. Others remained in their barracks, afraid that if they left, they would be punished. The psychological adaptation to camp life was so complete that freedom itself was disorienting. Frankl describes walking out of the camp with several fellow prisoners. they walked through the fields surrounding the camp, seeing flowers and trees, breathing air that was no longer suffused with the stench of death. One prisoner bent down to pick flowers, marveling at their beauty. Another sank to his knees and began praying. Frankl himself walked in silence, trying to comprehend that he was free, that no one would beat him for walking slowly, that he could go wherever he wished. The experience was surreal, dreamlike. Years of imprisonment don't disappear in a moment. The internal bars remained even after the physical ones were unlocked. Another immediate challenge was physical recovery. The prisoners were starving, diseased, many near death. The liberating forces tried to help, providing food and medical care, but even this was dangerous. Prisoners who ate too much too fast became ill. Their bodies, adapted to starvation, couldn't process normal amounts of food. Disease continued to kill prisoners after liberation, particularly typhus and dysentery. Frankl himself was ill with typhus during liberation and spent weeks recovering, hovering between life and death, even after freedom arrived. Liberation did not mean immediate health or safety. It merely meant a chance to survive, if one could overcome the damage the camps had inflicted. But the deepest trauma of liberation was the discovery of losses. During the camps, many prisoners had clung to the hope that loved ones had survived, that families would reunite, that life could be rebuilt. These hopes, though often unrealistic, sustained people through the worst times. After liberation came the reckoning, finding out who had died and how Frankl returned to Vienna as soon as he was physically able, searching for any member of his family who might have survived. His sister Stella had managed to escape to Australia before the war and was alive, but everyone else was dead. His wife Tilly, whom he had loved so deeply and imagined so vividly in the camps, murdered in Bergen-Belsen. His mother, murdered in Auschwitz. His father died of starvation in Theresienstadt. His brother Walter, murdered in Auschwitz. The family he had chosen not to abandon, the reason he stayed when he could have fled to America, all gone. The conversations he had conducted with Tilly during the marches were conversations with a ghost. The hope of reunion that had sustained him was a hope already lost. The meaning he had found in love and loyalty now had to be reconstructed without the people who had given it focus. This is perhaps the most profound test of Frankl's philosophy about meaning. He had theorized and verified in the camps that love transcends physical presence, that the meaning of love does not depend on the beloved being alive. Now he had to live that truth. Tilly was dead, but his love for her was not dead. The meaning that love had provided, sustaining him, giving him reason to survive, connecting him to his humanity, remained valid even though she was gone. The love itself was an achievement, a dimension of his own being, and death could not erase it. But this philosophical understanding could not eliminate the grief, the unbearable pain of loss, the question of whether survival without those he loved was worth it. Frankl experienced what he would later identify as depersonalization, a common response among survivors. The world seemed unreal, flattened, without meaning. Things that should have brought joy, freedom, safety, food, felt empty. He was alive, but did his life matter? What was the point of surviving if everyone he loved had died? Why had he survived when so many better people had perished? Survivor's guilt, though not yet named as such, was a profound weight. Had he done enough to help others? Had his survival come at others' expense? Could he ever justify being alive when Tilly was dead? These questions could have destroyed Frankl. Many survivors were destroyed by them, succumbing to depression, addiction, suicide. But Frankl made another choice, rooted in his philosophy of meaning. If his survival had any meaning, it must lie in what he could do with it. He had witnessed and learned things that millions of people needed to understand. He He had insights about human nature, suffering, and meaning that could help others. His survival imposed a responsibility to bear witness, to teach, to use his experience for the benefit of others. This would not bring back the dead or heal the wounds completely, but it would give his survival meaning, would justify in some small way his being alive when so many had died. Within days of returning to Vienna, still ill and weak, Frankl began dictating the book that would become man's search for meaning. He spoke for hours each day, racing against the fear that his memories would fade, or that he would die before completing the testimony. In 9 days, working in a kind of feverish inspiration, he produced the first draft of the entire book. The speed of composition is remarkable, but it makes sense. He had been composing this book in his mind for years, working through the ideas during the endless hours of forced labour, rehearsing passages during the long cold nights. Now he simply had to pour out what was already fully formed in his memory and imagination. The book, originally titled A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp, was Frankl's way of transforming his suffering into meaning. By writing it, by analysing what he had experienced and deriving lessons from it, he was doing something that only he could do. Other survivors might tell their stories, and many did, but Frankl uniquely combined personal testimony with psychological analysis and philosophical insight. He was not just describing what happened, he was explaining why some people survived and others didn't, what this revealed about human nature, how these insights could help people find meaning in their own lives. The dead could not speak, but Frankl could speak for them, could testify to what they endured and what their suffering revealed about human dignity and resilience. Beyond the book, Frankl had to rebuild his entire life. At 40 years old, he had nothing, no family, no home, no possessions. His pre-war work and reputation were interrupted, his career in ruins. He could have left Vienna, emigrated to America or elsewhere, started completely fresh. But he chose to stay, to rebuild in the city where he had been born and educated, where he had lost everything. He returned to work at the Vienna Polyclinic, the psychiatric hospital where he had worked before the war. He resumed seeing patients, applying the insights he had gained in the camps to help people with ordinary neuroses and depressions. He began teaching again, lecturing about logotherapy and his camp experiences. In 1947, Frankl married again. His second wife, Ellie, was a practicing Catholic, which required Frankl to navigate interfaith complexities in a time and place where such marriages were controversial, but the marriage was happy and lasted until his death, 50 years later. They had a daughter, Gabriele, born in 1947. Frankl was building a new family, not as replacement for what he had lost, but as a new source of meaning and love. Life was continuing despite death. This too was a testimony to the resilience of meaning-seeking. Even after total loss, humans can rebuild, can love again, can find new purposes. The liberation phase taught Frankl things that were as important as what he learned in the camps. He learned that freedom itself can be a burden, that people liberated from oppression sometimes don't know what to do with freedom, that depression and meaninglessness can follow even the most joyous events. He learned that grief is work, that it must be processed and integrated, that loss does not simply heal with time, but must be actively transformed into meaning. He learned that survival guilt is a powerful and dangerous emotion, that survivors must find ways to justify their survival through service or testimony or contribution. And he learned that life demands meaning-making from us, even in, perhaps especially in, our darkest moments of loss and despair. These lessons would shape logotherapy's approach to trauma, grief, and post-traumatic growth. Frankl would spend decades helping patients who had experienced terrible losses and traumas, drawing on his own experience to guide them toward meaning. He never minimized their pain or offered easy comfort. He acknowledged that some suffering seems senseless and unbearable. But he insisted that meaning is possible even in the aftermath of tragedy, that humans have the capacity to transform even the worst experiences into something that enriches rather than destroys them. Liberation taught him this as surely as imprisonment had. The search for meaning continues in every phase of life, under any circumstances, until the very end. This extraordinary burst of creativity was not a matter of inspiration striking from nowhere. Frankl had been preparing to write this book for years, mentally composing it during the camps, refining arguments and remembering details, conducting what amounted to participant-observer research under the most extreme conditions. The book was already written in his head. The 9 days were simply the pouring out of what had been brewing for years. But still, the speed and clarity of composition are remarkable, suggesting a man possessed by the need to speak, to testify, to make sense of the senseless. The book Frankl wrote was unusual in structure. It was not a straightforward memoir, though it contained memoir elements. It was not a philosophical treatise, though it contained profound philosophical insights. It was not a psychological textbook, though it introduced new psychological concepts. Instead, it was a hybrid, weaving together personal narrative, psychological analysis, and philosophical reflection. The first part told the story of his experiences in the camps, but not in exhaustive detail. Frankl selected specific moments and observations that illustrated broader psychological principles. The second part, shorter and more technical, introduced the basics of logotherapy and explained how his theory emerged from his camp experiences. This structure was deliberate. Frankl understood that readers would not simply accept abstract claims about meaning and psychology without evidence. By grounding his theory in the extreme test case of the concentration camps, he was making an empirical argument. These ideas are not mere speculation, but are verified by the most brutal laboratory imaginable. If meaning can sustain life in Auschwitz, then the will to meaning must be fundamental to human nature. If prisoners can exercise freedom in choosing their attitudes despite total external constraint, then human freedom is real, not an illusion. If love can transcend death and continue to provide meaning after the beloved is gone, then meaning has a dimension that goes beyond material circumstances. The book's original title was telling: A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp. This suggested an objective, scientific approach, a psychologist observing and analysing even while undergoing the experience himself. But the title also created distance, perhaps more distance than was appropriate given the horror of what was being described. Later editions would take on different titles. In English, it would eventually be published as Man's Search for Meaning, a title that captures the book's central theme more directly and universally. But that title came later, suggested by publishers who recognized that the book's appeal was broader than the specific story of one psychologist in the camps. Writing the book served multiple purposes for Frankl. First, it was therapeutic. By narrating and analyzing his experiences, by imposing narrative structure and meaning on what had been chaotic and senseless, he was processing his own trauma. He was moving from victim of history to witness and interpreter of history. This transformation, from passive sufferer to active meaning maker, is central to logotherapy's approach to trauma. We cannot change what happened to us, but we can change how we relate to it, the meaning we derive from it, the use we make of it. By writing the book, Frankl was demonstrating this principle in action. Second, the book was an act of testimony, a fulfillment of what many survivors felt as a sacred obligation, to speak for the dead. Millions had been murdered in the camps, their voices silenced forever. Those who survived had a responsibility to tell what had happened, to prevent the world from forgetting or denying, to bear witness to the evil, and also to the resilience and dignity displayed by victims. Frankl's book was his contribution to this testimony. He was saying, "This happened. This is what we endured. This is what I learned. This is what must not be forgotten." Third, the book was a professional contribution, an offering to psychology and psychiatry of insights gained at enormous cost. Frankl was not just telling his story, he was introducing logotherapy to a wider audience, arguing for a new understanding of human motivation and mental health. The camps had provided an unintended natural experiment in human psychology under extreme stress. What Frankl had observed there needed to be shared with the therapeutic community, incorporated into theory and practice. The book was thus a textbook as well as a memoir, a teaching tool for therapists and students. Fourth, the book was an answer to the question that haunted Frankl after liberation: why did I survive? What meaning does my survival have given that so many better people died? By writing this book, by sharing these insights, Frankl was creating retroactive meaning for his survival. He had survived so that he could write this, so that millions of people who would never experience such extreme suffering could nevertheless learn what the camps revealed about meaning, freedom, and human nature. His survival would benefit others. This did not erase his guilt or grief, but it gave him a reason to continue living, a task that justified his existence. The 9-day composition was just the beginning. Frankl would revise and refine the book over subsequent years. He would write additional books expanding on logotherapy, The Doctor and the Soul, The Will to Meaning, The Unheard Cry for Meaning, each developing different aspects of his therapeutic approach. But Man's Search for Meaning would remain his most influential work, the book that made his name and spread his ideas globally. Its publication history reflects this growing influence. Initially, the book struggled to find an audience. Publishers were hesitant. Holocaust memoirs were not yet in demand. The world was exhausted by war and wanted to move on, not dwell on horrors. The book was published first in German in 1946 under the title Ein Psychologe erlebt das Konzentrationslager. It sold modestly but did not become a bestseller. The English translation appeared in 1959 under a different title, From Death Camp to Existentialism. Again, sales were modest. It wasn't until the title was changed to Man's Search for Meaning and the book was marketed more broadly that it found its audience. By the 1960s and 70s, the book had become a phenomenon. It was translated into dozens of languages, assigned in college courses, recommended by therapists, passed hand to hand among people seeking wisdom about suffering and meaning. A Library of Congress survey in 1991 ranked it as one of the 10 most influential books in America. It has sold over 12 million copies worldwide and remains in print decades after its initial publication. This extraordinary reach means that Frankl's 9 days of dictation in late 1945 have touched millions of lives, helping countless people find meaning in their own suffering. What accounts for the book's enduring appeal? Partly, it's the power of the testimony. Frankl writes with restraint and dignity, never sensationalizing or exploiting the horror. He describes things matter-of-factly, letting the facts speak for themselves. This creates a tone of authenticity and authority. The reader trusts Frankl because he is clearly not exaggerating or manipulating emotions. He is simply telling what he saw and experienced. The horror emerges all the more powerfully because it is understated. But the book is more than Holocaust testimony. It offers something that pure memoir cannot, a framework for understanding and responding to suffering. Readers come to the book not just to learn about the camps, but to learn how to deal with their own suffering, which, while different in scale and kind, is nonetheless real and difficult. Frankl provides tools: the will to meaning, the 3 pathways to meaning, the freedom to choose one's attitude, the idea that life is asking us questions rather than us asking questions of life. These concepts are practical and applicable. They help people navigate divorce, illness, job loss, depression, bereavement, all the ways life inflicts suffering on us. The book also offers hope without dishonesty. Frankl does not promise that finding meaning will eliminate suffering or make life easy. He is brutally honest about how terrible suffering can be, but he insists that meaning is possible even in the midst of suffering, that we can say yes to life despite pain and loss and death. This message resonates especially with people in dark times, people who are looking for something more substantial than positive thinking or self-help platitudes. Frankl offers hard-won wisdom, philosophy tested in fire, insights that have earned their authority through suffering. That authority makes his hopeful message credible in a way that easier optimism is not. The 9 days in 1946, then, were not just a personal act of recovery or professional contribution. They were the beginning of something larger, a message that would spread across the world, across decades, offering meaning and hope to millions who would never know the camps, but who would recognize, in Frankl's words, a truth about their own lives. The speed of those 9 days, the urgency and clarity of composition suggests that Frankl understood, perhaps unconsciously, that he was creating something of lasting value. He was giving birth to a book that would outlive him, that would carry the lessons of Auschwitz forward long after the last survivor died. In that sense, the 9 days were one of the most productive periods of writing in the 20th century, measured not just by pages produced, but by lives touched and transformed. The first part is titled Experiences in a Concentration Camp, though different editions use slightly different wording. This section is autobiographical but selective. Frankl does not attempt to tell his entire story or to provide a comprehensive account of the camps. Instead, he focuses on psychological observations, on moments that reveal something important about how humans respond to extreme suffering. The narrative is spare, almost clinical in tone, which paradoxically makes it more powerful. Frankl writes like a psychiatrist taking case notes, observing himself and others with professional distance. This creates credibility. We trust his observations because he is clearly not hysterical or sensational, but carefully analytical. The structure of this first part follows the 3 psychological phases Frankl identified: the shock phase upon arrival, the apathy phase during imprisonment, and the phase following liberation. Each phase is described through specific examples and observations. We learn about the shock of selection, the loss of the manuscript, the daily struggle for survival, the capos who were cruel and the rare ones who were kind, the sunset viewed through barbed wire, the imagined conversations with Tilly, the night when Frankl talked suicidal prisoners out of touching the electric fence. These are not just stories, they are evidence for psychological principles. Throughout the narrative, Frankl weaves in his emerging insights about meaning. He describes how prisoners who lost their sense of meaning would literally die within days, lying down and giving up, immune to all efforts to revive them. He describes the man who gave away his last cigarette, proving that humans are capable of transcending self-interest even in extremity. He describes his own discovery that love transcends physical presence, that he could derive meaning from his relationship with Tilly, even in her absence, even, though he didn't know it at the time, after her death. These observations accumulate into an argument. The will to meaning is the primary human motivation, more fundamental than the will to pleasure or power. The second part, titled Logotherapy in a Nutshell, or sometimes The Principles of Logotherapy, shifts to a more technical and philosophical mode. Here Frankl directly introduces his therapeutic approach, explaining its 3 main pillars: the freedom of will, the will to meaning, and the meaning of life. He contrasts logotherapy with Freudian psychoanalysis and Adlerian individual psychology, arguing that both predecessors misidentified the fundamental human motivation. He explains his therapeutic techniques, particularly paradoxical intention and de-reflection, which we will explore in detail later. He discusses the existential vacuum, the widespread sense of meaninglessness in modern society, and how logotherapy addresses it. This second part could be dry or overly theoretical, but Frankl keeps it grounded with examples from his clinical practice and from the camp's theory and experience constantly intertwine. When he talks about attitudinal values, the stance we take toward unavoidable suffering, he illustrates with the prisoner choosing to give away his last bread. When he discusses the self-transcendent quality of human existence, he points to the prisoners who survived because they had something or someone beyond themselves to live for. When he explains tragic optimism, saying yes to life despite pain, he draws on his own journey from the camps through grief to rebuilding. One of the most powerful passages in the book comes toward the end, where Frankl articulates what he calls the meaning of life. This is a deceptively simple phrase that Frankl uses in a specific technical sense. He does not mean that there is one universal meaning that applies to all people at all times. That would be reductive and false to human diversity and the contingency of circumstances. Rather, Frankl argues that life has potential meaning under any circumstances, even the most tragic. This meaning is always specific and personal, your meaning in your situation. The question is not, what is the meaning of life in general, but what is life asking of me right now? What is the specific meaning available to me in this moment? This formulation inverts the usual relationship between the individual and meaning. We tend to think of ourselves as the questioners, asking life what it means, demanding that existence justify itself to us. Frankl reverses this. Life is questioning us, and we must provide the answers through our actions and attitudes. We are responsible to life, not life to us. This shift has profound psychological implications. Instead of waiting passively for life to reveal its meaning or complaining that life is meaningless, we recognize that we are the ones who must create meaning through our responses to what life brings. Meaning is not found through contemplation but through action and attitude. Another crucial concept introduced in this second part is what Frankl calls the self-transcendent quality of human existence. This ungainly phrase points to something essential. Humans are fundamentally oriented beyond themselves. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. Love is always love of someone. Work is always work on something. We exist in relationship to a world outside ourselves, and meaning arises in that relationship, not in isolated self-contemplation. This is why Frankl is critical of approaches that focus too much on self-actualization or self-fulfillment. The paradox is that we fulfill ourselves most completely, precisely when we forget ourselves in service of something beyond ourselves. The book also introduces the concept of tragic optimism, which Frankl would develop more fully in later writings. This is optimism in the face of what he calls the tragic triad of human existence: pain, guilt, and death. These three are unavoidable features of being human. We will all suffer, we will all fail and feel guilty, we will all die. A philosophy that ignores these realities is naively optimistic, disconnected from the truth of human existence. But pessimism, concluding that pain, guilt, and death make life meaningless, is equally wrong. Tragic optimism holds both truths simultaneously. Life includes terrible things, and yet life is worth affirming. We can say yes to life despite everything. How is this possible? Through the transformative power of attitude. Pain can be transformed into achievement when we bear it with dignity and derive insight from it. Guilt can be transformed into growth when we use it to change ourselves for the better. Death can be transformed into an incentive to responsible action when we recognize that our time is limited and therefore precious. Frankl's own life exemplifies tragic optimism. He endured terrible pain, lost everyone he loved, faced death repeatedly. Yet he emerged insisting that life retains meaning, that existence is worth affirming, that suffering itself can be meaningful if we choose the right attitude toward it. The book concludes with reflections on responsibility and the Statue of Liberty. Frankl proposes only half-jokingly that the United States should complement the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast with a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Freedom, he argues, can degenerate into license and chaos without responsibility. The freedom to choose our attitude, which Frankl proved possible even in Auschwitz, comes with the responsibility to choose wisely, to choose in accordance with meaning, to choose responses that affirm our values and contribute to something beyond ourselves. Freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. Neither makes sense without the other. What made man's search for meaning so influential was precisely this combination of personal testimony and philosophical depth, memoir and theory, darkness and hope. Frankl showed that meaning is possible in the darkest circumstances and explained how to find it. He offered not platitudes but hard-won wisdom. He wrote with authority, earned through suffering, not claimed through credentials or philosophical argument alone. And he wrote accessibly, in clear prose that anyone could understand, about ideas that are both profound and immediately practical. The book also came at the right time. By the 60s and 70s, when it found its widest audience, Western societies were experiencing what would later be called a crisis of meaning. Traditional religious frameworks were weakening. The optimism of post-war prosperity was giving way to questions about whether material success constituted a meaningful life. The counterculture was searching for alternatives to mainstream values. In this context, Frankl's message resonated. Meaning is not given by tradition or created by prosperity. It must be discovered by each individual through engagement with life's challenges. This was existentialism made practical, philosophy applicable to everyday struggles. Readers found in Man's Search for Meaning not just a Holocaust memoir, but a guide to living. The book answered questions people were asking about their own lives. How do I deal with suffering? What makes life worth living? How do I find purpose? What remains when everything is taken away? Frankl provided answers grounded in the most extreme test case imaginable. If his philosophy worked in Auschwitz, surely it could work in the suburbs, in the office, in the hospital, in the struggles of ordinary life. The book became a bridge between the extreme and the everyday, showing that the same principles apply across vastly different scales of suffering. At the heart of logotherapy lies a simple but radical claim. The fundamental human motivation is not the pursuit of pleasure, not the quest for power, but the search for meaning. This is what Frankl calls the will to meaning, and it is the cornerstone that distinguishes his approach from all predecessors. To understand why this idea is radical, we need to see it in contrast to the prevailing theories of Frankl's time and our own. Sigmund Freud had argued that humans are primarily motivated by the pleasure principle. We seek pleasure and avoid pain. All of our behavior, when traced to its roots, serves this fundamental drive. Even apparently selfless or spiritual motivations are, according to Freud, sublimations of more basic drives, particularly sexual libido. Religion, art, love, work, all are sophisticated ways of pursuing pleasure or avoiding pain, dressed up in cultural clothing but fundamentally hedonistic. Freud's theory was deterministic and reductive, but it had tremendous explanatory power and dominated psychiatry for decades. Alfred Adler challenged Freud with a different fundamental motivation, the will to power. According to Adler, humans are primarily driven by the desire to overcome feelings of inferiority and achieve superiority or significance. We want to matter, to be important, to have impact. This drive shapes personality and behavior more fundamentally than sexual desire. Neurosis arises when our pursuit of superiority becomes maladaptive, when we develop a fictional goal of dominance that isolates us from healthy social interest. Adler's theory was more social and optimistic than Freud's, but still fundamentally about self-advancement. Frankl accepted that both pleasure and power matter to humans. We do seek pleasure and we do seek significance. But he argued that both Freud and Adler had confused effects with causes, means with ends. Pleasure and power are typically byproducts of something more fundamental, the fulfillment of meaning. When we find and fulfill meaning in our lives, we often experience pleasure and sometimes achieve power or recognition. But pursuing pleasure or power directly, as ends in themselves, tends to frustrate both. The more directly you aim at pleasure, the more it eludes you. The more you grasp for power, the more it slips away. This is what Frankl calls the paradoxical nature of happiness and success. They ensue, they cannot be directly pursued. Meaning, in contrast, is something we can pursue directly. We can ask, what is meaningful to me? What tasks are calling me? What purposes give my life significance? And we can then orient our lives toward those meanings. When we do this, pleasure and power may follow as side effects, but they are not the goal. The goal is the meaning itself, the work we find worthwhile, the people we love, the causes we serve, the attitudes we adopt toward unavoidable suffering. This reorientation from pleasure and power to meaning changes everything about how we approach life and therapy. Frankl illustrates this principle with clinical examples. He describes patients who had achieved great success, wealth, fame, power, but were depressed and empty. They had won the game as defined by society, but the victory felt hollow. Why? Because success without meaning is unsatisfying. Pleasure without purpose becomes boredom. Power without significance becomes burdensome. These patients needed help not in achieving more, but in discovering what genuinely mattered to them, what would give their lives direction and substance beyond mere accumulation of pleasure or power. Conversely, Frankl observed that people with very little pleasure or power in conventional terms could be deeply satisfied if their lives had meaning. The camp prisoners who gave away their last bread had no pleasure and negative power. They were utterly dominated. But they had meaning. They were being true to themselves, expressing love and compassion, maintaining human dignity. That meaning sustained them better than extra calories or privilege would have. This empirical observation, that meaning trumps pleasure and power, became the foundation of logotherapy. The will to meaning manifests differently in different people and circumstances. For some, meaning comes primarily through creative work, building something, making something, contributing something to the world. This might be artistic creation, scientific discovery, business innovation, teaching, parenting. Any activity where we give something of value for others, meaning comes primarily through experiential values. What we receive from the world through love, beauty, nature, art, relationships. And for everyone, there is the possibility of attitudinal values, the stance we take toward unavoidable suffering, the attitude we choose when circumstances cannot be changed. These three pathways to meaning, creative, experiential, attitudinal, are not hierarchical in normal times. But attitudinal values become supreme when creative and experiential values are blocked, when we can do nothing and enjoy nothing, but can still choose our attitude. This was the revelation of the camps. Even there, meaning was possible through attitude alone. The will to meaning also explains phenomena that other theories cannot. Why do some people become depressed despite having everything? Because they lack meaning. Why do some people thrive despite poverty or illness? Because they have meaning. Why does retirement sometimes trigger depression? Because people lose their sense of purpose. Why does addiction often fill a void? Because substances or behaviors substitute for genuine meaning. The existential vacuum, the widespread sense that life is meaningless, is not a failure to achieve pleasure or power, but a failure to find meaning. Logotherapy identifies 3 fundamental ways we can find meaning in life. Creative values involve what we give to the world through our actions, our work, our deeds, our contributions. Experiential values involve what we receive from the world through encounters, love, beauty, nature, relationships. Attitudinal values involve the stance we adopt toward unavoidable suffering, how we bear what cannot be changed. In normal circumstances, we access all 3 pathways. We work and create, we love and experience beauty, and occasionally we face hardship with dignity. But life sometimes blocks certain pathways. Illness might prevent work. Loss might eliminate beloved relationships. In such circumstances, attitudinal values become crucial. When nothing external can change, internal attitude remains free. The prisoner giving away his last bread exemplified this. Stripped of creative and experiential possibilities, he found meaning through his chosen attitude. This hierarchy is not rigid. A meaningful life integrates all 3 pathways. The key insight is that meaning remains possible under any circumstances, because at minimum, we always retain the freedom to choose our attitude. Modern society faces what Frankl calls the existential vacuum, a widespread sense of meaninglessness. People have lost the traditions that once guided behavior and the religious frameworks that once provided meaning. Without these external structures, many feel adrift, unsure what life is for, filling time with distractions rather than living purposefully. Symptoms include boredom, Sunday neurosis, when the work week structure disappears, addiction, aggression without clear cause, and depression rooted not in chemical imbalance, but meaninglessness. Frankl saw this vacuum as the defining illness of modern life, more fundamental than specific neuroses. Logotherapy addresses this by helping people discover their unique meanings. The therapist doesn't prescribe meaning, but helps patients find what calls to them specifically. This requires listening to conscience, which Frankl calls the meaning organ, our intuitive capacity to sense what matters. Logotherapy employs specific techniques, particularly paradoxical intention. This involves deliberately doing or wishing for the very thing one fears, breaking the anxiety cycle. A man who fears sweating in public tries to sweat as much as possible. A woman with insomnia tries to stay awake. By removing the fearful anticipation, the symptom often disappears. This works because anxiety feeds on itself through anticipatory fear. The more we fear something, the more likely it becomes, which increases our fear. Paradoxical intention interrupts this cycle by changing our attitude toward the symptom. When we stop fighting it and instead embrace it with humor, it loses power. Another technique, dereflection, shifts attention away from self-observation toward meaning beyond the self. Excessive self-focus, what Frankl calls hyper-reflection, creates many problems. A man obsessed with sexual performance fails because he's watching himself rather than connecting with his partner. The solution is dereflection, focusing on the partner, the relationship, the meaning of the encounter, rather than on one's own functioning. This reflects logotherapy's core insight about self-transcendence. Humans are fundamentally directed beyond themselves toward meanings, purposes, and other persons. Genuine fulfillment comes not from self-focus, but from self-forgetting in service of something meaningful. The more we aim at happiness or self-actualization, the more we miss them. They arrive as byproducts of pursuing meaning. Frankl positioned logotherapy as the third Viennese school after Freud and Adler. He agreed with Freud that unconscious processes exist and matter, but disagreed that humans are merely driven by pleasure. He agreed with Adler that social factors and future goals matter, but disagreed that power is the ultimate motivation. Frankl's unique contribution was centering meaning as fundamental, grounded in empirical observation from the camps. Unlike purely theoretical systems, logotherapy was tested under extreme conditions. Where existential philosophy analyzed existence abstractly, Frankl developed practical therapeutic applications. Where humanistic psychology focused on self-actualization, Frankl emphasized self-transcendence. Frankl's deepest experiential meaning came through love for Tilly. During camp marches, he imagined her presence, conversed with her mentally, felt sustained by love. He discovered that love transcends physical presence. It's an achievement of the lover, not dependent on the beloved being available. When he learned after liberation that Tilly had died months earlier, this insight became personal truth. His love remained real, meaningful, sustaining, even though she was gone. The meaning of love lies in understanding and affirming the beloved's unique potentiality, which persists beyond death. This understanding helps people cope with loss. Love doesn't end when the beloved dies. The relationship transforms, but meaning persists. Memory becomes treasure. What was shared cannot be taken away. This offers profound consolation without denying grief. Suffering itself is not meaningful. Frankl adamantly rejects that notion. Unnecessary suffering should be eliminated, but unavoidable suffering can be transformed into meaning through the attitude we adopt toward it. When nothing external can change, we can still choose how we bear our burden. The camps proved this. Suffering without meaning, senseless torture, was unbearable and broke many prisoners. But suffering born for a purpose, to witness, to remain human, to honor values, became endurable, not pleasant, not desired, but meaningful and therefore bearable. Frankl helped a father grieving his son by asking what would be different if the father hadn't loved so deeply. The pain proved the love. The grief had meaning as testimony to what mattered. This didn't eliminate pain, but transformed it from meaningless suffering to meaningful sorrow. Frankl proposes tragic optimism. Optimism in face of the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death. These are unavoidable. A philosophy ignoring them is naive, but pessimism concluding they make life meaningless is equally wrong. Tragic optimism holds both truths. Life includes terrible things, yet life is worth affirming. Pain can become achievement through dignified bearing. Guilt can become growth through change. Death creates urgency that makes meaning possible. Without mortality, nothing would matter because everything could be postponed infinitely. Frankl lived this philosophy. After losing everyone, enduring hell, he rebuilt, remarried, had a daughter, worked for 50 more years. He said yes to life despite everything. Frankl proposed complementing the Statue of Liberty with a statue of responsibility. Freedom without responsibility becomes license. The freedom to choose our attitude carries responsibility for choosing wisely, choosing in service of meaning. Between stimulus and response lies space for freedom. We are not merely products of conditioning or drives. But this freedom is burdensome. We cannot blame circumstances for who we become. Responsibility means owning our choices and their consequences. Conscience guides this responsibility, serving as our meaning organ that intuits what specific situations require of us. Modern psychology increasingly validates Frankl's insights. Positive psychology identifies meaning as a pillar of well-being. Research links purpose to longevity, resilience, and health. Meaning-centered therapy helps cancer patients. The meaning crisis describes widespread purposelessness. Cross-cultural studies suggest the search for meaning is universal, though meaning's content varies culturally. Post-traumatic growth research shows trauma can deepen rather than destroy meaning when processed well. Frankl's ideas increasingly inform therapy, education, and research decades after his death. Logotherapy faces legitimate questions. Can meaning be measured scientifically? Is the theory culturally specific to Western contexts? Does Frankl romanticize suffering? Some critics argue his "you can always find meaning" places unfair burden on sufferers. Frankl acknowledged limitations. Logotherapy works best for existential problems, meaninglessness, purposelessness, but not all mental illness is existential. Biological and chemical factors matter. Logotherapy complements rather than replaces other treatments. The camps also don't prove meaning exists subjectively. Perhaps Frankl and others created subjective meaning in meaningless circumstances. Frankl insisted meaning is discovered rather than invented, but this remains philosophically debatable. Contemporary society faces acute meaning crisis. Post-religious culture lacks shared frameworks for significance. Mental health problems rise. Deaths of despair from suicide and addiction increase. Work feels meaningless. Technology distracts but doesn't fulfill. Climate change creates existential dread. Frankl offers secular spirituality, meaning without requiring religious belief. His philosophy works whether you're religious or not, addressing the universal human need for purpose. For generations facing widespread purposelessness, Frankl's message resonates. Meaning is available, always, through creative action, loving relationships, or chosen attitudes towards suffering. What does meaningful life look like practically? It's not grandiose. Small meanings matter: the kindness extended, the work done well, the moment fully present. Meaning is context-specific, discovered through asking what this particular situation requires of me. Work provides meaning when experienced as vocation, not mere job. Relationships offer meaning through genuine connection. Suffering teaches when we attend to what it reveals. Legacy matters less than presence, making meaningful choices now rather than just preparing for future impact. Frankl himself exemplified this, living 92 years, working, writing, teaching, mountain climbing, flying, being present to his second family while honoring what he'd lost. Frankl spoke of supra-meaning, an ultimate cosmic meaning beyond our comprehension. We may not understand the total picture, but faith that meaning exists even in apparently senseless suffering enables tragic optimism. This faith need not be religious. Secular practitioners can engage logotherapy. What matters is trusting that meaning is possible even when not currently visible. The camps tested this. If ultimate meaning exists, it existed even there, even when no one could see it. Man's Search for Meaning became one of the 20th century's most influential books. Over 12 million copies in 50 languages. Viktor Frankl Institutes worldwide continue his work. His ideas permeate therapy, education, and culture. The book's influence reflects its message meeting universal need. People across beliefs and cultures recognize truth in Frankl's insights about meaning, freedom, and suffering. His legacy lives in millions who found purpose through his words. We return to Nietzsche's words: "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Frankl proved this in Auschwitz. His why, love, work, witness, kept him alive. After liberation, spreading this message became his why, giving his survival meaning. The question now is yours. What is your why? Not rhetorical, genuine question requiring genuine answer. Your why is unique, changes across life stages, but provides compass through difficulty. Having a why makes suffering bearable, gives direction, creates meaning. Frankl's final gift is this assurance: meaning is always available. In any circumstance, even the darkest, freedom remains to choose your attitude. Life is asking you questions, through challenges, joys, sufferings, opportunities. You answer through your choices and actions. Everything can be taken from you except one thing: the freedom to choose your response. In that freedom lies your humanity, your dignity, your capacity for meaning. The camps proved this. If meaning was possible there, it is possible anywhere. If Frankl could choose meaningfully in Auschwitz, we can choose meaningfully in our lives. Not comparison. Our suffering is real, even if different to the universal structure. Suffering plus freedom equals potential meaning. The invitation, find your why before crisis, forces the question. The promise, with a why, any how becomes bearable. Your life means something. Meaning is available now, waiting to be discovered through what you create, what you experience, and how you face what cannot be changed. This is Viktor Frankl's message, purchased at the highest price, offered freely. Say yes to life despite everything.